Good morning. The vision which brings us together at this year's Finance in Common Summit is fostering infrastructure and finance for just and sustainable growth. The teams of the International Committee of the Red Cross are present in over 100 countries, and they register 120 active conflicts. That is 3 times more than just 3 decades ago. Our experts assess that 210 million people are currently living under the full or partial control of armed groups. These are areas where state institutions struggle to deliver the most basic public services, from health to schooling to water to electricity. And this figure has been growing year on year. So can we really speak about just growth if these populations are left behind? And can we speak of sustainable infrastructure when hospitals, schools, water or electricity systems are the first targets of military operations? What does resilient infrastructure mean when cities are literally leveled to the ground? Look at Raqqa, Khartoum, Kharkiv or Gaza and imagine the cost of reconstruction. Can the global economy afford it? This isn't a theoretical question, as states are reducing their development budgets to ramp up their defense investments, increasing their ability to destruct, and reducing their capabilities to reconstruct. Now, that is a bleak picture, and we need to recognize that our conference is taking place in a very worrying environment. But the good news is that it is possible to de-risk infrastructure investments in fragile contexts through well-designed partnerships between development banks and humanitarian actors. We're well beyond the proof of concept in places such as Mosul or Goma or Beirut, but we need to scale and speed because we know that by 2030, 6 out of 10 people living in extreme poverty will be living in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Now, the other piece of good news is that there are binding rules in armed conflict. They include, in particular, the Geneva Conventions, and they happen to be the one set of rules that are universally accepted, signed, and ratified by all countries. International humanitarian law, or IHL, is not just about protecting people, it's also safeguards to the vital infrastructure that civilians rely on, even in the midst of war. But we clearly need better compliance. And this is why 6 states, including South Africa, China, Brazil, France, Kazakhstan, Jordan, recently joined forces to launch a high-level initiative to enhance the respect for these rules, including the protection of basic infrastructure from destruction in wartime. So I have 2 messages at the Finance in Common Summit. First, public development banks can de-risk investments in post-conflict settings. They can also prevent development reversals by staying engaged when the situation degrades, thereby preserving essential public systems that have required decades of investments. We already do it with the French Development Agency, with the World Bank, or the African Development Bank today. It can be brought to scale tomorrow with more of you. Second message, G20 finance ministers can leverage international humanitarian law as a global public good that can reduce the toll of war on essential civilian infrastructure. And I think you'll agree with me that in the coming years, we will need to use all the levers we have at hand. So let me unpack these 2 messages using a few real-life examples that are happening as we speak. Imagine yourself or your children living in a city where the power has gone out, not for hours, but for days, even weeks. Hospitals shut down, water stops flowing, food supplies dwindle. And this is not an isolated incident, but a recurrent reality for millions of people trapped in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And this is happening right now in places such as Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A few weeks ago, more than 2 million people were caught in the fighting, which damaged the power lines supplying electricity to hospitals, water stations, even the laboratories storing highly sensitive medical samples. With no time to lose, the ICRC team stepped in with generators and water trucks to support the city's hospital, in which our teams were treating hundreds of war-wounded patients. But we didn't stop here. As a neutral intermediary, we negotiated access across front lines for the public utilities company, who were able to restore power to 70% of the city, ensuring that hospitals could continue saving lives. This is what humanitarian action looks like today in today's conflict. Not just the generators and the water trucks, but maintaining essential systems alive. If we fail to act differently from what we've done in the past, crises will continue eroding development gains, deepening inequalities, and escalating the costs of recovery. The human development and finance communities can leverage their respective mandates, expertise, and assets to drive impact where it matters most. And in doing so, we will not only rebuild, but also prevent the costly reversals of hard-won development gains by preserving that critical infrastructure, but also help systems stay resilient in times of conflict. One key lesson that we draw from close to a decade of work with public development banks in fragile settings is that we need to create the right conditions for engagement. These institutions hold the key to sustainable impact, and in our experience, there are three ways in which we can work together. First, when we de-risk investments, financial actors can help restore vital infrastructure. Look at Mosul in Iraq. The ICRC has been present in Iraq for several decades. The fighting, which engulfed Mosul in 2017, significantly reduced and damaged the water system on which millions of people relied. In the immediate aftermath, the ICRC provided emergency response and supported local water authorities to ensure minimum service provision. But over subsequent years, based on a master plan of the infrastructure and strong relationships built over many years with the local water authority, the ICRC has been able to progressively step back as a public development bank stepped in with finance and expertise. Despite many challenges, it is an example of a responsible handover in practice and at scale. Almost a decade on, Mosul is rebuilding and residents once again have clean water. Today, 88% of households rely on piped water, and 86% of subscribers express satisfaction for the service. So it is possible to de-risk investments in fragile and conflict settings and to successfully exit from a humanitarian context. We did it in Iraq, and we intend to do it with a coalition of partners in Maiduguri, northern Nigeria, and elsewhere. Secondly, we can protect essential services in the midst of conflict, thereby preventing development reversals that take decades to rebuild. I already told you about Goma, but this is also what we've done in Syria in a project called Too Big to Fail. That project has stabilized the domestic water service delivery to 12 million people, produced from one of the largest critical potable water facilities in Syria. Water system was at risk of failing, a typical tipping point with huge costs associated, water trucking, but also health and reconstruction costs. Spare parts were difficult to procure and to import due to companies' overcompliance with sanction regimes, which in fact provide for humanitarian carve-outs, and that's something that the ICRC has been able to leverage thanks to its mandate. At times, and no later than just last month, we negotiated with parties to the conflict to spare the facilities and their personnel from attacks. So it is possible to prevent systems from reaching that tipping point and collapsing. We're doing it today in Syria, but we would like to do it tomorrow in parts of the Sahel and Afghanistan, where public systems are at risk. Thirdly, when we build system resilience, we ensure that communities are not just surviving, but reclaiming their future. This is a lesson that we draw from collaborations with a development bank in support to Rafik Hariri Hospital, Lebanon's largest public hospital in the southern suburbs of Beirut. There, instead of bringing ICRC surgical teams in and out of the hospital at every peak of violence, we've decided to team up with a French development agency to support the hospital in the long run. Over the last 5 years, the initiative accompanied the ministry through the shocks of COVID, the Beirut port explosion, and the mass casualty events related to the most recent war. Lebanon's Minister of Health recently explained that the health system was at points at a breaking point, and that this unique collaboration between a public hospital, a humanitarian actor, and a development bank really made the difference. But partnership is not enough. Without enhanced respect for international humanitarian law, IHL, there is no foundation for a sustainable impact. IHL is a legal framework, but it's much more than that. It's that lifeline that preserves human dignity, protects civilian infrastructure, and strengthens pathways back to peace. So let's go back to Goma. When the fighting destroyed the power grid, we didn't just restore electricity. We reminded all parties to the conflict of their legal obligations. We negotiated safe access for engineers and ensured that hospitals and water stations remained protected. So respect for IHL reduces the cost of war, not only for those caught in conflict, but for the global community. When we uphold IHL, we achieve three things. We protect civilian lives and infrastructure, ensuring that hospitals, schools remain functional. We prevent mass displacement and family separations, giving communities a reason to stay and rebuild. We create conditions for lasting peace by reducing the grievances that fuel further violence. So let me venture that international humanitarian law is a global public good, and that unlike other global public goods, public development banks haven't leveraged it to the full. And this is something that we can do together through the high-level initiative on IHL that has recently been launched by the ICRC's presidents, with 6 states working across contemporary geopolitical divides. So let's imagine a different future, one where conflict does not mean total collapse, where essential services are protected, and where communities can rebuild in dignity. That future is possible, but only if we act together in our respective roles and mandates. Humanitarian actors can envisage responsible exits and handovers to local actors where possible, driving long-term resilience. Development and financial institutions can step into fragile conflict and conflict settings, not as bystanders, but as active partners, and this is critical to delivering on their own mandates. And governments and armed actors can uphold IHL, not just because it is a legal obligation, although that is important, but because it's the foundation for peace and the best insurance against massive infrastructure breakdown. The global community, including the G20, must recognize respect for IHL as a global public good, ensuring it is integrated into policy measures, financial frameworks, and platforms that protect civilian infrastructure, lives, and livelihoods. This is not just a humanitarian imperative. What is at stake is the preservation of gains of decades of patient investments in public infrastructure and systems. So perhaps the next time the power goes out in Goma, it won't take a war and a humanitarian action to turn the lights back on. I thank you.